So the question is India procuring or planning to procure the Su-57 Felon?
Well, so firstly, let's do a little bit of a background on the Su-57 and India, because this dysfunctional love affair between the two has existed for about nearly 2 decades now, actually. Because in early 2007, Russia and India decided to sign a joint agreement to develop a fifth generation fighter. So, as I said, nearly 2 decades ago, design contracts were allocated in the 2010s and all that sort of stuff. And then as we went on, the sort of expected stuff happened, project delays and requirements not being met and disagreements between the partners. And I think the sort of roadblocks and the sort of nails in the coffin were really the disagreements and also the inability of the program to meet the expectations set out by the Indians. So if we look at what originally was cited by the Indians, the kind of low observability characteristics of the Su-57 weren't what they expected. And there was also some complaints about the avionics and also how Russia was unwilling to release some of the avionics. But also there was an issue where the maintenance and support and sustainment costs were unacceptable to the Indians. But also another really interesting thing, and we'll round back to this after, is the Indians wanted a twin-seat fighter because of the additional, what they felt would have been the additional workload, when it came to like man-on-man teaming and all the information presented to the crew on board. Um, you know, they felt that it would have been overwhelming for a pilot to operate, operate the aircraft and also be able to understand and take in the information being provided by the variety of sensors on board. So the Indians really wanted a twin-seat aircraft, whereas the Russians really wanted a single seat. Now, this was something that was particularly this last point. This was something that was actually sort of worked out in the end. Was the Indians would, I believe, the twin seat would have been developed in India or with India or something like that. I'm going from memory here. And basically, the agreement was, Russia would procure X amount of twin seats, India would procure X amount of single seats. Actually, I think it was the twin seats would have been built in India and the singles had been built in Russia, and they both basically agreed to procure a set number of each one. So both partners were able to benefit from that in theory. There was some other there have been some things that have been corrected since the reports. So, for example, there was an Indian report citing like a lack of radar blockers and S ducting, and they quoted, the F-35 uses S ducts, and so does, they quoted the FA-18 Super Hornet makes use of radar blockers. But the Su-57 at its time, didn't have any treatments applied to its intakes because, they used the same old flanker style podded intakes, it exposed the fan blades of the engines, increasing its reflectivity. So, these were things that were corrected in subsequent production models and also prototypes. The Su-57, we know for a fact it makes use of radar blockers, for example. So, it's not like yeah, I think but at the time of these disagreements and whatnot, the project was in its infancy, and as it matured, things did improve. And actually, we also saw now, and this is what sort of triggered this all, is the Russians developed a twin-seater of the Su-57 with their own funding, without any Indian funding or any Indian nudges. The Indians didn't nudge them into this, and they weren't. The partnership was over in effect. And that's quite interesting because if we look back at the original project, it was something the Russians really weren't very interested in. They really just were interested in a single-seater aircraft. It was the Indians that were pushing for the twin seat. And it's really interesting because it shows on the Russian side that they're really, really looking to get India back on board onto the Su-57 program. And there's a multitude of reasons for this, right? Like scalability is a big thing. Production, the Russians aren't really able to buy these in huge numbers. And actually, the Russians scaled back their orders, I believe, during the FGFA times, to then increase the number of legacy fighters to offset the sort of costs of this procurement. So, the Russians really need a partner in this program for production scale, to bring down those costs, and to be able to exploit these economies of scale and really make it an affordable program. Because at the moment, the Russians don't exactly have huge numbers of the Su-57 in production. In service. I think they've got one export order with Algeria. It's not like huge numbers either. And they've got a massive development cost that they need to amortize over some production units. And for that reason, the Russians are really, really desperate for a partner, not only a surface level partner, but like a deep industrial partner, like the Indians have always been for the Russians. And now, if we, I'll rope you into this as well, Bilal, at some point. But this is, if we look at the Su-57, I am personally of the belief that this would possibly be one of the best things to happen for Pakistan in terms of Indian procurement, is if the Su-57 was to be purchased. Firstly, we've discussed this in an episode prior, and I'll reference it again. It's the episode we did on the next big project for the Pakistan Air Force is a tactical data link. It's one of our earlier episodes, and you'll find it if you scroll down. But in that episode, it talks about how fifth generation fighter aircraft and advanced systems like fifth and like UCAVs and whatnot are really, really the systems on board are really, really well integrated into the airframe itself, but also with the other systems. So you can't, if we talk about like legacy radars, for example, like the F-16, if you look at the F-16, you could fit the scalable agile beam radar, or the Sabre. I think it's the APG-83 on the line, right? You don't need to like take the aircraft out of service. You don't need to. You can fit that. You can retrofit that on the line. So because the integration into the airframe isn't that deep, right? Nor is the integration into with the other systems like to the level of something like a F-35 or a J-35 or even a Su-57 in this case. A lot of the systems are built into the airframe itself. If we look at some of the antennas, for example, they modern fifth generation aircraft, and even the next generation, the subsequent generation, will make use of CLBAs, like conformal load bearing antennas, for example. And those are antennas that are just baked into the airframe, right? You can't just go and swap them out. Other than that, you've got, as I said, these systems are deeply integrated with one another. The Russia and the Indians, from the start, had a requirement for different avionics. So the Russians, for example, used the N-036 radar on their Su-57s, and the Indians had a requirement, or it was basically a new radar that was developed specifically for the Indian aircraft. So if we go back to what I was saying, is I think it would probably be the best thing to happen to Pakistan is if the Indians were to go into this Su-57 program, and for example, demand that changes were to be made, or we change equipment for Indian equipment like radars or electronic warfare systems or whatever. We're talking, firstly, you need to go out and develop these systems. The Su-57, for example, if the Indians wanted to put a new radar on it, the Su-57 makes use of a ton of arrays. I believe it's got about 5 front-facing radar arrays, which is a pretty big number. Some in the L band, some in the X band. I can't remember. Yeah, so it's not something that can just be adapted from another design that they may have, and just adapt it into the Su-57. Not only that, but like these are, for example, these radars are very well integrated into your data links and into your electronic warfare systems, and it's all very, very well linked. That's the key here, is everything is very deeply integrated. So all of these modifications and changes add time, add cost, and complexity to a already very complex program. On top of that, we know that any changes to these systems would push the procurement back by decades even, and this isn't necessarily a procurement that would happen overnight already. So we're already talking timelines, in 2030s, 2040s, 2050s type thing. On top of that, the other really sort of beneficial thing for Pakistan would basically just kill AMCA, right? There would be no AMCA. It just would stop existing, because at some point there's going to have to be a conversation in the IF, because they have, their fingers are in too many pies, type thing. People will say they've got a huge budget and all these sort of things, but that budget is depleting pretty fast. When we talk about 114 Rafales, it's not a cheap buy by any standards. Then we've got money being poured into AMCA, then Tejas, then Mark II, and all these things. It's something's going to need to give. And if the Indians are procuring an in-class Su-57, I feel AMCA would probably be the first thing to give as well, because again, the AMCA in itself, from my perspective, and I'm not super well versed on it, so I'm sure somebody will correct me in the comments. But AMCA in itself is a pretty ambitious, I say, or even I would say, delusional timeline, right? 8 to 9 years from now for induction is just not happening. There's no chance. On top of that, there's this, like, with India, there's always, and Pakistan as well, to be fair, there's always like weird bureaucratic red tape. Now the Indians have disqualified HAL from producing the AMCA, right? I believe of the production partners, this is all off the top of my head, but I think 1 or 2 had aerostructures experience. I think it was Tata who had some, Lockheed offloaded some production of C-130J and F-16V parts to Tata. So, they're probably, from memory, they're the only ones with aerostructures experience. So there's also that, right? Like your production partners don't even have the experience needed to produce what you want them to produce. So it's like there's a lot of uncertainty on that front. So having a Su-57 in India, possibly even being produced in the Su-30 production lines, because the Russians said that the lines are not significantly different. You could adapt the Su-30 MKL production line to make Su-57s, and everything would be okay. It would so it would basically be a death sentence for AMCA, in my opinion. The other key thing is the maintenance being an issue, where as I said before, the Russians, this was like not even like at the peak of Russian sanctions, right? So the Indians had already identified that the Su-57 would be quite difficult to maintain. It would be quite problematic on that front. And this was, as I said, when the Russians were in a relatively better position. Now, if we look at this, the Russians are in an infinitely worse position. They're heavily sanctioned, more than they've ever been before. Everybody's cracking down on the flow of parts and fancy equipment to Russia to ensure that they can't continue to support these industries. And on top of that, these fifth generation fighter aircraft are already heavily maintenance intensive. So we take a very maintenance intensive program that was already even more maintenance intensive than expected, and then reduce the flow of spare parts, make sanctions, put sanctions in place, make transfer of money and equipment even more difficult. You're in for a cocktail of maintenance issues again. On top of that, the other really really important stuff, in my opinion, and the more interesting bits is obviously the political backlash as well. And I think this is where, Bilal, you'd probably be able to touch on better than me. Is the political backlash would be huge. Europe is like at the peak of its anti-Russian sentiment, rightfully so, right? And I cannot imagine a world where it would not be up in arms against India if this was to happen. A Su-57 buy would basically be a massive cash injection into the Russian economy, into the Russian aerospace industry, and it would also be directly seen as blood on Indian hands. They are directly supporting the Russian war machine via a purchase of the Su-57. It would be a massive purchase. It would be a massive cash injection, which is exactly what the Russians need for these industries. Because ever since the Cold War, we've seen the Russian aerospace industry has been on its decline, right? Like, they've been struggling financially. MiG, for example, was basically defunct, not defunct, but it's effectively ineffective. They're not making anything new. They're really relying off of sustainment and support contracts. Sukhoi is doing quite well, but they need a partner. They need a partner, and they need a cash injection. And the Indians have always been that cash cow for the Russians. That when the Russians need a bailout, the Indians are the people to call. And in exchange for the bailout, they'll offload some technology and some work to the Indians, and the Indians will be happy as well. The Indians know how to play the Russians, but the key here is it would be perceived really, really horribly in the West. Europe would be up in arms against India. The US would be, the US probably, while maybe less upset than the Russians, but it's pretty clear that the US is also quite growing tired of India and others buying Russian oil, for example. So we may even see CAATSA get enacted here. It would be devastating for the Indians politically, diplomatically, and also in supporting their current equipment as well, right? With heavy sanctions from the West, who knows whether they'd be able to carry on supporting this stuff, their Western origin platforms. The other thing is also obviously Russia and India. India gets locked into Russia again for the next couple of decades, and once again, obviously, that's driving a wedge in between India and the West because of Ukraine, and also it gives you the sort of double benefit that the Ukrainians are also not going to be particularly interested in Russia as well. In India as well. The other sort of last, maybe a little bit more like analytical type point I want to touch on is the Russian, and this is more like in reference to the J-35 and other competitive aircraft, is the Russian aerospace and electronics industry is like very questionable at best nowadays. Maybe not in terms of aerospace, but particularly avionics, right? The Russians are quite dependent on legacy systems, and the N036 is basically the first ever sort of production widely deployed Russian fighter ASA, full stop, right? The Russians have not been able to successfully mass produce an ASA radar for a fighter aircraft until the Su-57. They tried with the MiG-35, but I don't believe they managed to get much in way of export orders. I think they have a few in service in the Russian Air Force, but it's been very, very limited. So this is the first widely deployed Russian radar. And the problem is, and this is, I'm sure, something that the Indians will pick up on as well, because it's something that they've complained about before, is the legacy systems on board. Is that even the N036 relies on legacy technology. Like, for example, it's a gallium-arsenide based radar, and there are obviously going to be downfalls and negatives associated with that. For example, gallium-nitride radars, they allow a superior power density, sometimes even up to by like a factor of 10. So you can theoretically like pump more power in, basically improving your performance, while even when limited by the physical size of the array. They're obviously also less thermally efficient, so basically less radiated power, more and more cooling needs, more heavy duty cooling needed. Gallium nitride radars also have longer duty cycles, so basically, how long it's radiating due to them being more efficient. You're also able to play with higher power like waveforms due to having a far larger power budget. You've got better beam sharpening ability, which obviously gives you greater detection range. So basically, in effect, like gallium nitride, the current generation of systems are basically better in every single way. And there's a lot more that we can go into in detail. Maybe we'll do an episode on radars later, but in effect, the Russians, the N036, which is the sort of crown jewel of the Su-57 and the crown jewel of the Russian avionics industry, is still heavily reliant on older gen tech, where most of the world is moving towards gallium nitride based radars and onwards as well. So yeah, basically, it's kind of like it's you know it would be very beneficial for Pakistan for this to happen. You'd lock India into a failing Russia once again for the next, 3, 4, 5 decades, maybe not 5 decades, but 2, 3, 4 decades. India is once again locked into what is a failing Russia. Russia is a shadow of what it was once upon a time, and it will continue to shrink as this war goes on and its economy gets crippled. I don't know if you've got anything to touch on with what I've said, Bilal. If not, we can get on to our next segment.
Yeah, I mean, that was comprehensive. I mean, if I just had to add a few things, I would say that, at least from the Indian perspective, I can see why this is happening. And I don't think it's solely because of the apparent threat of the PEF potentially procuring J-35s. I don't think that's the sole driver. Because if you look at the way India's defense procurement stuff works, I've been trying to follow it for some time now. I begin to notice, I've been beginning to notice two trends. The first is that the Indian Air Force has a generally hate relationship with the Indian defense industry. I feel that the two tend to be on opposing sides quite a bit. Now, this is a very gross misreading. They have a lot of alignment, right? And then the alignment tends to come, in my perspective, on the Russian aircraft. So what you find is that if you look through India's defense procurement history, you find that the Russians have traditionally been the most willing to offload technology to build the Indian industry's capacity and to help that industry leverage its capacity to the point where they can essentially produce pretty, I would say, seizable chunks of an aircraft domestically through indigenous inputs. Like I think with the Su-30, for example, I think about a significant chunk of the engine is basically manufactured within India using Indian inputs. Like it's not even assembled; like it properly manufactured there. In addition to parts of the Su-30 and what have you. So the Russians have been willing to basically invest, or rather transfer, actual capacity and technology. And of course, on the Indian side, you have to credit them that they've been investing in the upstream inputs to be able to absorb that technology or that know-how to be able to manufacture stuff. So basically, like if you were to put India on a spectrum, it's maybe like a lot closer, not maybe, it's actually definitely a lot closer to where China was or is, as opposed to where Pakistan is, right? I mean, that's like, there's no comparison there. However, I would say is that but with each year, they're getting close to where China is in many of the upstream inputs. However, they have some very, big structural problems, which pretty much every country now faces except for China, which is in the rare earths, critical technology side. However, that being said, the point is, and the main point is that the Russians, especially now, if you look at the way Putin is promoting the Su-57 to India, they are willing to basically literally contract work out to the Indian industry. And I feel that Moscow is also likely willing to negotiate or at least discuss real supply chain integration with India, because as you said, they themselves need that now, right? The war in Ukraine has been very taxing on them. The US-led and now European-led co-led sanctions have basically been, really stifling Russia's ability to leverage the international market for, the most advanced inputs. They are solely dependent on the Chinese, and that can raise some questions later as well, which we'll get into discussing towards the end of the podcast. But the point being is that Russia needs India, and I think they are willing to definitely basically like genuinely co-produce the Su-57 because it might be too difficult for the Russian industry to handle on its own at this time, given the circumstances. And that is resonating with the Indian defense industry. And the Indian defense industry, whether it's the state-owned actors, the private sector actors, they know that they're going to get a bigger chunk of the revenue pie through a Russian deal than a French deal. Now, the nature of the French deal is that, the French, I think, you can recall the whole, like, the ongoing issue they're having, the friction point they're having over the source codes, or, allowing India to integrate its own munitions to the Rafale. I think with the French, the issue is that no matter what they promise, the problem the French have, especially the French government, is that they have a very aggressive labor class. Like, their labor parties, or their labor, like their labor politics, is a very difficult thing to sort of win over. And if the French government at any given point loses the support of the labor groups, then they stand to lose the elections the next year. So Macron and these guys, they cannot go around, like, I mean, how much are you going to give India? Like, just put yourself in the seat of a Western politician, right? Like, you're going to give India immigration, you're going to give India exports, right? You're going to allow Indian goods to come into the European market or the French market. You're going to do offshoring to India. Are you also going to now give them the Rafale as well on top of that? Like, how much is the French labor class going to actually tolerate, right?